Hello and welcome to CJB Games, Cameron here, and today we are continuing work on Groundskeeping, a first-person multiplayer hotel maintenance horror game. It's getting very close to the end of this sprint, which is exciting, so now basically we're finishing off the last parts and making sure it's all good for testing. First things first today, we are working on a bit of the environment, and more specifically we are making a lamppost. So let's hop into Blender and get this shit going. Weirdly enough, I wanted it to look rather short and kind of sad for a lamppost, and I just only wanted it to be a slightly bit taller than the player. Basically, I wanted to make it look interesting. I thought this would be fitting with this model in particular, as it's situated right next to the kids' playground area. This would just be a one-off lamppost as well, with every other lamppost looking a lot more appropriate, as you'd expect. And hopefully this will give this part of the environment a bit more character and interest, and you'll be able to discern it from other parts of the random vegetation around the main area. The model itself wasn't too challenging to create, with a large portion of it being just simple cylinders. With the model done now, we can move on to the placement in the scene. Usually with an asset, I would begin to texture right away after creating it. But when an asset has interesting features, like lighting in this case, I usually jump the gun and try and get it into the scene as soon as possible. It was a little difficult getting the brightness correct for the light portion of this, as I only wanted it to light up a small area around it. This is because I don't really want the player to be able to survive the night outside any of the interior parts of the game. I want them to have to find light and go indoors when the sun falls, and this should, have them potentially trapped indoors with the killer, which will make for quite a nice spooky dynamic. With the blueprints behind the lamppost all set up and ready to go, we can now begin to texture it. Most of this was rather easy, with it basically being all variants of the same metal and just a bit of dirt here and there. The actual part of it that lights up will all be handled in-engine via blueprint anyway. This will basically be a material change to be emissive when the light turns on. One of the more interesting parts of the material, however, was the PNG I imported as a brush, so I could plaster these sort of worn-down messages on top of the lamppost. For this I went with some littering signs, and I feel like these really help the believability and the storytelling of this prop in particular. So with our first outdoor light created for the game, it's time we begin our day-night cycle so this asset can have some use. I'm currently using Unreal's default lighting system, so the plan is to make a blueprint that will link up to the directional light in the scene and slowly change its rotation to simulate a full rotation of day and night. Luckily, Unreal already handles all the beautiful sunrises and sunsets and its other lighting components in the scene, so what I have to do is not too much art-based, but more just blueprint-based. Like I said, this whole process was largely blueprint focused, and the challenges were more in finding the most cost-efficient way to get this done, and the multiplayer aspect of getting it all to sync up. I mean, the last thing I want is for the sun setting at different times for different players, as that will completely ruin the flow of the game. At this point I played around a lot with the speed of the day and night. I think in the end I went for 800 seconds total for the entire day, and this was split down evenly in the middle, so the player will have a lot of night time to contend with as well, which I think will make for a fun experience. The theme I was going for was that sort of first night you get in Minecraft, where you can see that sun setting, you have the dread of trying to make a house. That, but ideally ramped up 10 times. Now that that's all finished, we can start creating the next asset for our environment. This time I want to create a tileable fence that I can populate the edges of the road with. I went for a simple design of wooden planks all attached together, and I decided that the vertical planks would have a random pattern to how they were placed, so it would look a bit more hodgepodge put together. In hindsight though, this was not a good idea. It would be fine if this fence was a one-off piece, but because this fence pattern repeats a lot, the random placements of these vertical planks ended up looking just like a mistake that I had made instead of something intentional. If I have time, and if I can be bothered, this will be fixed later on. Again, due to my eagerness, I got the asset into the engine straight away so I could begin placing it on the side of the road. Once all of them were placed, I also went through the foliage with a fine-tooth comb to make sure nothing was obviously clipping into the newly placed fence. Similarly with making this asset, the texturing was very easy to do and was just a simple wood texture. Now we can move on to creating the third type of fence for this environment. At this point, I think I'm going a little bit overboard with how many fence variants I've introduced, but it's too late to stop me now. On the bright side, however, this fence will be the most interesting as it is barbed wired inclined. I had a lot of fun creating the pattern of the metal spikes and how they wrapped around the cylindrical wooden posts. I also decided that it would be too subtle to have just horizontal barbed wire, and I was scared that the player would keep running into it and getting frustrated as to why they couldn't pass through. So I added some vertical metal as well that would split up the length of the fence. This really brings the whole asset together, I think, and whilst it meant it took me longer to model it, it was definitely worth it. It was so worth it, in fact, that I ended up adding another horizontal piece to the metal wires, and now I think the player will definitely realise that they simply cannot run through it. So now we can move on to the texture, which will mainly consist of wood, metal and dirt. As I briefly mentioned performance last episode, it was becoming more apparent now that as I was placing the barbed wire fence that the current scene was way too heavy. I was having to place the asset in unlit mode, which is never a good sign. Unfortunately, there is no time in this sprint to address this issue, but it's something I'll be paying close attention to for fixing next sprint. With all fences now placed, I once again took a look at the foliage to make sure it was all behaving. And there we go, all environment art for this sprint is complete and we can move on to the final task. Because obviously I knew the playtest was next, I had to quickly add something that would ideally help with performance. From my sort of deep dive into the scene, I found that a lot of the performance budget fell upon the shadows. So I want to add the option to tweak the shadows in the game. The plan is to give the player 4 options, with the bottom option completely turning the shadows off. This wasn't too hard to achieve and basically consisted of me finding the correct console commands and settings to edit. Then I just made sure that whatever the player chose would be saved into their game file. And there we have it, that is the end of sprint number 3. I had a lot of fun with this sprint and I look forwards to testing out all of the features with my friends. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you can keep up to date with the continuation of this game. And if you want to support me further, you can find my previous game on Steam now. It's called Escape from Violet Institute and is a 2D side-scrolling first-person survival horror game. It's an okay-ish game, I kinda like it at least. Well, thank you for watching guys, and I shall see you all next time.